If you've clicked on this video, it's likely because you suck at drawing hands. In which case, don't be too hard on yourself. Not even robots understand them. Tricky little buggers, aren't they? But allow me to assuage your worries, dear viewer, as I believe with a bit of anatomical knowledge and shape language we can fix that. Y'all voted for a hands tutorial in a previous poll, so here it is. As usual, I'm using illustrations from Classic Human Anatomy by Valerie Winslow. We'll start off with some anatomical guidelines. Here we have the three major muscle groups of the palm, the proper names for which I don't feel like pronouncing, doesn't really matter. The largest muscle group is on the thumb side, then there's the padding at the base of the fingers, and another muscle group on the pinky side of the hand. These muscles are what allow you to pull your fingers together and spread them apart. Fun fact, the center of the palm has virtually no muscle to it, as it's mostly made up of tendons, which is why it's thinner compared to the outer sections of the hand. On the right is another illustration just highlighting the major creases of the hand, which can be good to include for the sake of adding some realism. Moving on to proportions, it's important to note that the fingers are approximately half the total length of the hand starting at the wrist. The middle finger is also the longest, followed by the index fingers, with the pinky being the shortest finger, creating an obvious curve. The pinky finger also stops around the third joint of the index fingers. These more specific measurements aren't that important, to be honest. The main takeaway here is that halfway point. Also, an additional note I'd like to throw in, there is an obvious overlap where the thumb side of the hand meets the wrist, whereas there is none on the pinky side. This is one of those tiny details that can actually do a lot to make your figure drawings more convincing. Now for structure. As you can see, the palm of the hand can be thought of as a three-dimensional box, and the thumb portion as a rounded form placed on top. The fingers are similarly rectangular in shape. I'm sure this isn't really a new concept to most. A lot of tutorials will recommend breaking things down into boxes and planes when learning to draw just about anything, but as I say in my initial anatomy video, it's best not to focus too much on it. Boxy drawings are good to do as a warm-up, but it's more of a mental exercise. The goal is to get you thinking more three-dimensionally. Making your actual drawings too boxy will make your figures look robotic. Good for mechanical or man-made subject matter, not so much for organic matter. I'll also note that there is a wedge shape connecting the wrist to the hand. Keeping this wedge in mind will help you avoid rubbery-looking joints, similar to that example I showed at the beginning. Now we'll explore shape language and silhouette using a few hand photos I stole off of Tumblr. People tend to have an especially hard time getting hand proportions looking right because of how many different angles and variations they can be posed in, but taking a step back and looking at the overall shape the hand is making should simplify things. So long as all of the fingers are contained within this shape in your own drawings, you'll be left with accurate looking proportions. Also take a look at how the fingers curve and flow in a particular pattern. In the upper left example, the fingers all flow towards the middle of the palm. In the profile view, the fingers follow a downward curve, and the upper right image shows the obvious curvature of the thumb and pinky joints. I'll now examine these hands individually and how I would draw each of them. Here's my own study of this photo. Notice how I only use a couple lines to show the tension at the wrist instead of the 5 or so lines seen in the actual photo. Then there's the obvious lines for the thumb and pinky portions of the palm. I've included some smaller lines indicating the bottom padding and bony joints of the fingers, which help to describe their form. And lastly, I've included some of those larger creases I mentioned in the anatomy portion of this video. Learning what lines are best to include and which to leave out to maximize visual appeal is very important to drawing and will take some time to get a good feel for. Rule of thumb is not to include very many lines unless you're going for a really hyper-realistic look. On to the next one, there's a line for the knuckle to give some depth to the drawing, as well as that slight overlap at the thumb side of the wrist I mentioned. I've also included the folds of skin between the forefinger and the thumb, and notice how I include some small lines to give volume to the finger that's closest to the viewer while leaving the remaining fingers blank. The level of detail is important. Now for the third and final example. We've got points of tension at the base of the thumb and once again the wrist. And notice how in this example I've included lines near the base of the other fingers despite them not actually being present in the original photo. This is a case of me taking a bit of creative liberty for the sake of making things look more three-dimensional. I've also added a few lines to imply the tendons of the hand and where they meet the base of the knuckles. Something else that's important to bring up in this particular photo ref is how the two middle fingers naturally bunch up together while the other finger and pinky are separated. This is yet another pattern that will help add realism to your drawings. This same sort of pattern is often seen with the palm facing up as well. Lastly, I've grabbed a few samples of more cartoony hands from Ivsinachi Adrian, a storyboard artist on Instagram. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Just to show how a more simplified style can be applied to the hands. Pay attention to the kinds of shapes being used. What's the overall silhouette of the hands? How is this artist implying the knuckles and separating the thumb and index fingers from the other fingers? How are things overlapping? Here's a few more hand drawings that are a lot quicker and gestural in their execution. They're simple, a bit messy, but it's still clear what we're looking at and what the hands are doing. As a bonus, I'll throw in a couple of my own stylized hands from a recent drawing of mine. I've emphasized that pinky muscle group while leaving the rest of the hand as a simple silhouette. In the other hand, the forefinger and thumb are closest to the viewer while the rest of the fingers recede behind it. Again, simple but effective. And that wraps up this video. Now that I've done a hands video, I'll probably do a different one on feet, if only to scratch the completionist portion of my brain. But that's it for now. Go home.